I did that early. A nice man who gave me everything I wanted.
Is this the only man you were really in love with?
I would say so.
There are some loves that don't reveal themselves in the beginning, but only at the very end, when there is nothing left to protect and no reason left to hide. By the time Katharine Hepburn finally spoke the truth about the man she loved most, he was already gone. And for decades, she had lived with that silence. The world believed they understood her independence, her defiance, her refusal to belong to anyone. But behind that image was a quieter story, one shaped not by freedom, but by a love she could never fully claim. Many men came into her life. Only one remained, and that truth took a lifetime to admit. The marriage that never felt like home. In 1928, long before Hollywood had fully discovered her, Katharine Hepburn made a choice that seemed, at the time, perfectly ordinary. She married Ludlow Ogden Smith, a kind, well-meaning man who admired her deeply and believed in the life they could build together. For a moment, it looked like the beginning of something stable, something expected. But Hepburn was never meant for expectation. Even in those early years, there was a quiet restlessness in her. She wasn't drawn to comfort. She was drawn to movement, to challenge, to becoming something more than what the world had planned for her. And as her ambitions began to take shape, the distance between them slowly widened. Smith tried to adapt. In fact, he admired her so much that he even altered parts of himself to better fit into her world. But love, at least for Hepburn, could not survive on admiration alone. She didn't want to be supported. She wanted to be understood. And that understanding never fully came. By the early 1930s, as her career began pulling her toward Hollywood, the marriage had already started to fade. There were no dramatic endings, no public scandals, just a quiet realization that what they shared was not enough to sustain the life she was stepping into. They separated, but never formally divorced, a detail that would follow her for years, quietly shaping the way she navigated future relationships. Looking back, this marriage wasn't a failure. It was something more important. It was the first sign that Katharine Hepburn would never stay where her heart didn't belong. The man who quietly stood behind her rise. By the early 1930s, as Katharine Hepburn stepped cautiously into Hollywood, she was still finding her footing, not just as an actress, but as a woman navigating an industry that often demanded conformity. It was during this fragile, formative period that Leland Hayward entered her life. He wasn't like the others. Where many saw Hepburn as unconventional, too sharp, too independent, too unwilling to play the game, Hayward saw possibility. He understood the kind of presence she carried, the quiet intensity behind her confidence. More importantly, he knew how to position it. Their connection was never loudly defined. There were no grand declarations, no headlines that captured what existed between them. Instead, it lived in the spaces between conversations, in the trust that slowly built as her career began to rise. Hayward became more than a professional guide. He was a stabilizing force during a time when everything around her was shifting. As she transitioned from stage to screen, from uncertainty to recognition, he stood close, offering direction, influence, and perhaps something deeper that neither of them fully named. But Hepburn was not someone who anchored herself to quiet dependence. As her confidence grew, so did her sense of autonomy. The very thing that made her drawn to Hayward, his understanding, his control of the industry, also became something she needed to move beyond. She wasn't meant to be guided forever. She was meant to lead. And so, like many connections in her life, this one didn't end with conflict. It simply faded as she stepped further into her own identity. Still, his presence left a mark. Because in those early years, when everything was uncertain, Leland Hayward was one of the few who saw her clearly, before the world ever did. And sometimes, those are the people we remember, not for how long they stayed, but for when they arrived. the brilliant man who couldn't keep her. By the mid-1930s, Katharine Hepburn was no longer searching for her place. She was becoming impossible to ignore. But with recognition came pressure, and with pressure came the kind of men drawn to brilliance. None were more intense or more unpredictable than Howard Hughes. He entered her life like a storm. Hughes was not just wealthy. He was obsessed with speed, with control, with pushing beyond limits most people never dared approach. And for a time, that world fascinated Hepburn. He introduced her to flying, to risk, to the kind of adrenaline that matched her own inner restlessness. With him, life felt larger, faster, sharper. But excitement is not the same as connection. Hughes admired her strength, but he also tried, subtly, persistently, to shape the world around him. And Hepburn was not someone who could be shaped. The very independence that drew him in was the same force that kept slipping beyond his reach. There were moments, no doubt, when something deeper seemed possible, a quieter connection beneath the intensity, but it never quite settled. It never found stillness, because Hughes lived in extremes, and Hepburn lived in truth. She didn't need constant motion to feel alive. She needed something steadier, something that could meet her without trying to contain her. And slowly, almost inevitably, the relationship began to fracture under its own weight. No public fallout, no dramatic goodbye, just distance, growing where excitement once lived. In the end, Howard Hughes gave her something important, but not what she was truly looking for. He showed her that thrill could feel like love, but it could never replace it. The director who challenged her spirit. By the late 1930s, Katharine Hepburn had already proven something rare in Hollywood. She could not be molded. While studios still tried to shape their stars into predictable forms, Hepburn resisted, quietly but firmly. And that resistance found its greatest test in a man known for his own unyielding will, John Ford. Ford was a director of discipline, control, and authority. He believed in structure, in hierarchy, in knowing exactly where everyone stood. And when he encountered Hepburn, he met something he couldn't easily define. She didn't challenge him loudly. She simply didn't bend. Their connection was never built on softness. It was built on friction, on long silences, sharp glances, and an unspoken understanding that neither would fully yield to the other. Ford respected strength, and Hepburn embodied it. But respect, in this case, came wrapped in tension. There were moments when that tension almost resembled something deeper, a quiet curiosity, a sense that each saw something rare in the other. But neither of them was willing to step beyond their own nature to explore it. Because both valued control, and neither wanted to lose it. For Hepburn, this chapter wasn't about love. It was about definition. Standing across from a man as strong-willed as Ford forced her to clarify something within herself. She didn't just want independence. She needed it. And while Ford may have admired her, even been intrigued by her in ways that were never spoken, their connection was never meant to grow into anything lasting. It remained what it had always been, a meeting of two powerful forces that refused to move for each other. The man who understood her, but never claimed her. Long before the world fully understood Katharine Hepburn, there was someone who saw her clearly, without needing to change her, soften her, or define her. George Cukor. Their connection began in the early 1930s, during a time when Hepburn was still navigating Hollywood's expectations. Where others saw her as difficult, Cukor saw precision. Where others questioned her independence, he recognized it as truth. And from that understanding, something rare began to form. Not romance, something quieter, and in many ways, more enduring. Cukor became a constant in her life, professionally and personally. He directed her in multiple films, shaping some of her most important performances, but their bond extended far beyond the set. With him, Hepburn didn't need to defend herself. She didn't need to explain who she was or why she chose the path she did. He simply knew, and perhaps that was why their connection never turned into love, because love, at least in the way Hepburn experienced it, often came with complication, with sacrifice, with imbalance. But this was different. This was ease. Cukor offered her something few men ever could, a space where she could exist fully, without expectation. There was no pressure to become anything more, no quiet demand for emotional compromise, just mutual respect, intellectual closeness, and a shared understanding of craft, of life, of identity. And so, their bond endured, through decades, through changing careers, through the shifting landscape of Hollywood. George Cukor remained, steady, present, and quietly essential. He never claimed her, but in many ways he understood her better than anyone ever could. And sometimes that kind of connection doesn't need a name. It simply stays. The chemistry the world mistook for love. By the late 1930s, Katharine Hepburn had regained her footing in Hollywood after a period many had quietly written her off, and standing beside her, with effortless charm and a presence the camera seemed to adore, was Cary Grant. To the world, they looked inevitable. They shared the screen in Bringing Up Baby, 1938, and later in Holiday, 1938. And something about their energy, quick, intelligent, almost playful, felt real in a way audiences couldn't ignore. There was rhythm between them, a natural balance. He was polished where she was raw, composed where she was unpredictable. Together, they made sense, or at least it seemed that way. Off-screen, there was admiration, mutual, sincere, and lasting. Grant respected her mind, her refusal to conform. Hepburn appreciated his discipline, his control, the quiet effort behind his effortless image. They understood each other in ways that made working together feel easy. But ease is not always love. There was no great conflict between them, no dramatic tension pushing them together or pulling them apart. And perhaps that was the very reason it never became more. What they shared was balanced, respectful, and beautifully contained, but it lacked the kind of emotional weight that defines something deeper. The world saw chemistry, but chemistry can exist without longing. And Hepburn, whether she admitted it or not, was drawn to something more complicated than comfort. She didn't just want connection. She wanted intensity, truth, and something that challenged her at a deeper level. With Cary Grant, she found harmony, but not the kind that stays with you when everything else falls away. And so, what the world believed could have been love remained something else entirely. A perfect illusion, convincing but never real. The love she could never live without. In 1942, during the filming of Woman of the Year, Katharine Hepburn met a man who would quietly reshape the rest of her life, Spencer Tracy. There was no spectacle to their beginning, no sudden spark the world could point to. What formed between them was slower, deeper, almost inevitable. He was grounded where she was restless, reserved where she was outspoken, and somehow, in that contrast, they found balance. But their love came with a truth neither of them could escape. Tracy was married to Louise Tracy, and he never left that marriage. And so, what they shared had to exist in the shadows. For 25 years, their relationship remained largely hidden from the public eye. They worked together, built a quiet life around each other, and developed a connection that didn't rely on grand gestures or public acknowledgement. It lived in the ordinary moments, in the understanding that neither needed to explain. Hepburn, who had spent her life resisting compromise, made an exception for him. She adjusted. She stepped back. She protected something that could never be fully hers. And yet, she stayed. Because with Tracy, she found something she hadn't found anywhere else. Not thrill, not admiration, not ease, but truth. Their love was not perfect. It was complicated, often painful, shaped by absence as much as presence, but it endured. Through illness, through time, through everything that might have broken something less real. In his final years, Hepburn cared for him quietly, away from attention, as his health declined. And when he passed in 1967, she didn't attend the funeral. Out of respect for the life he had publicly lived, she never tried to claim him, because she never needed to. Years later, when she finally spoke about him openly, there was no performance in her words, no attempt to reshape the story, only a quiet, undeniable truth. He was the love of her life. In the end, Katharine Hepburn's life wasn't defined by how many people she loved, but by how honestly she chose to love. She walked away when something didn't feel true, even when it was expected of her to stay. And when she finally found a love that mattered, she protected it, not with declarations, but with quiet loyalty. Spencer Tracy was never hers in the way the world understands love. Yet somehow, he was the one who stayed the longest. In memory, in silence, in truth. And maybe that's the question her story leaves behind. Is the greatest love the one you can hold, or the one you never had to prove? If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more untold Hollywood truths.